Welcome back to another 10-minute timeline. Today, we are going to discuss a conflict that occurred half a world away, and that had such a profound impact on the United States, the Vietnam War. Our tale begins with the French colonial rule over Vietnam, a reign that was not without its fair share of resistance. A prominent figure of this resistance was none other than Ho Chi Minh, a man whose unwavering desire for independence would light the fuse of conflict. Vietnam, a land divided with the North under the influence of Ho Chi Minh and his communist ideologies, found support from the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the South, backed by the United States, held on to its non-communist stance. This geopolitical chessboard was set against the backdrop of the Cold War, a time when the world was split between two ideologies, capitalism and communism. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the fallout of World War II, a time when decolonization was on the rise and nations were grappling with the idea of self-governance. The struggle for independence in Vietnam was a part of this larger global narrative. The United States, wary of the domino effect of communism spreading across Southeast Asia, embraced a policy known as the domino theory. The belief was that if one country fell to communism, then its neighbors would follow like a row of falling dominoes. This theory led to an escalation of US involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s under President Johnson. The United States committed troops and initiated bombing campaigns, marking the beginning of a war that was to be longer and more divisive than anyone could have anticipated. This was not just a war between North and South Vietnam. It was a war of ideologies, a war of attrition, and a war that would test the resolve of nations. And so, the stage was set for a war that would divide nations and ideologies. As the 1960s rolled in, the Vietnam War took a drastic turn with the commitment of American troops and the initiation of bombing campaigns. It was a pivotal decade in the war, marked by an escalation that would drastically change the course of the conflict. The roots of this intensification can be traced back to the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, who made the fateful decision to commit American troops to the fight. The commitment of these troops wasn't just a show of force. It was a clear shift in the United States' stance from a supportive role to active participation. Johnson's decision didn't stop at committing troops. He also initiated extensive bombing, aptly named Operation Rolling Thunder. This operation was not just a series of random attacks. It was a calculated strategy aimed at crippling North Vietnam's ability to wage war. The campaign targeted infrastructure, hoping to disrupt transportation and communication links, and demoralize the North Vietnamese. However, the decision to bomb was not without its repercussions. The bombing campaigns, along with the ground offensives, resulted in a staggering number of casualties. The majority of these casualties were Vietnamese civilians, their lives caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't choose. The American troops deployed to Vietnam were also not immune to the brutality of war. Thousands of young men were sent to fight in a foreign land, many of whom never returned. But the Vietnam War was not just a war in the traditional sense. It was also a testing ground for new military strategies and weaponry. The use of helicopters for troop transport and attack, the deployment of chemical agents like Agent Orange, and the reliance on guerrilla warfare tactics by the Viet Cong were all hallmarks of this conflict. These elements added a new layer of complexity to the war, making it one of the most infamous in history. But the Vietnam War was not just fought on the battlefields of Southeast Asia, it was also a war of public opinion back home. The United States found itself divided like never before, with the conflict sparking widespread opposition and fierce anti-war movements. The heart of America's cities became the backdrop of a different kind of war, one fought with words, ideas, and sometimes, tragically, with violence. Protesters took to the streets in droves, passionately voicing their dissent, their cries echoing off the walls of institutions they felt had betrayed them. They held placards high, their messages clear and poignant: "Make love, not war. Hell no, we won't go." The anti-war sentiment was not just a fringe movement, it penetrated deeply into the fabric of American society. The social and political ramifications of this opposition were profound. The anti-war movement led to a generational divide, with the younger population clashing with their elders, challenging their beliefs and values. It was a time of upheaval, a time of questioning authority and the status quo. Key events such as the Kent State shootings in May of 1970, where 4 students were killed by the Ohio National Guard during a protest, sent shockwaves through the nation. The Pentagon Papers, a secret Department of Defense study of US political and military involvement in Vietnam, leaked to the press in 1971, further eroded public trust in the government. These events served to fuel the anti-war sentiment, making it a defining feature of the era. But it wasn't just the streets and college campuses that were battlegrounds. The war found its way into living rooms across America, with television bringing the harsh realities of the conflict into homes. The media played a pivotal role in shaping public opinion, making the Vietnam War the first television war. In 1975, a chapter of history closed with the fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War was coming to an end. The North Vietnamese forces, fueled by Soviet support, had achieved their ultimate goal: the unification of Vietnam under a single communist regime. The streets of Saigon, once vibrant and bustling, were now scenes of chaos and despair. American helicopters hovered over the US Embassy, evacuating the last of the American personnel. The poignant image of a helicopter lifting off from the embassy rooftop, leaving behind a desperate crowd of Vietnamese civilians, remains etched in the collective memory of a generation. The aftermath of the war was a tragic tableau of destruction and loss. South Vietnam, now under communist rule, faced severe economic hardships. The war had ravaged the land, and it would take decades for the country to recover and rebuild. The human cost of the conflict was staggering. Over 3 million lives were lost, including some 58,000 Americans. The majority of the casualties were Vietnamese civilians, caught in the crossfire of a war they did not choose. The war had far-reaching effects beyond the borders of Vietnam. In the United States, it sparked widespread opposition and led to significant social and political changes. The images of war, so raw and unfiltered, shook the American public and led to a wave of anti-war protests. It also led to a reassessment of US foreign policy and the role of the United States on the global stage. As the dust settled, the world was left to grapple with the legacy of the Vietnam War. It was a war that tested the limits of human endurance, a war that questioned the morality of nations, a war that forever changed the face of the world. The echoes of this war continue to reverberate, reminding us of the high price of conflict and the enduring value of peace. The echoes of the Vietnam War are still felt today. This prolonged and divisive conflict that spanned over a decade left indelible marks on both the United States and Vietnam, shaping their histories and futures profoundly. In the United States, the war's aftermath brought about significant changes in the country's foreign policy. It led to a more cautious approach towards military interventions and a re-evaluation of strategies. The war's unpopularity and the public's reaction to it gave rise to the War Powers Act of 1973, putting constraints on the president's ability to send troops overseas without congressional approval. The repercussions of the war on the veterans were particularly severe. Thousands returned home bearing physical and psychological scars, many suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The lack of a clear victory and widespread anti-war sentiments led to many veterans feeling marginalized and misunderstood, a sentiment that still resonates with many today. In Vietnam, the war's impact was even more devastating. The conflict resulted in over 3 million deaths, with a significant number being Vietnamese civilians. The war-ravaged landscape took years to recover, and the economic consequences were felt for decades. The unification under a communist regime led to drastic changes in the country's social and political structure. Yet, despite the devastation, Vietnam has shown remarkable resilience. Over the years, it has managed to rebuild itself, emerging as a rapidly developing nation, balancing its past while looking towards a promising future. Understanding the Vietnam War is crucial, not just for history buffs, but for anyone who seeks to understand the world we live in today. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the profound impact it can have on nations and individuals alike. So, as we delve into the annals of history, let's remember the lessons learned and the sacrifices made. And as you journey with us through these 10-minute timelines, please remember to like and subscribe for more insightful dives into the past.